Okay, so we're here for a session on intimacy and seduction. And the motivation for this came towards the end of a conversation we shared Aspasia on your channel. I really enjoyed that conversation. We can perhaps put a link to it. We've explored some of these dynamics over the years, certainly intimacy. And putting the two together is important. I, from the outset, did do a little bit of thinking, but also wanted to enter this fairly fresh because I realized that even the word seduction could be approached more positively or more negatively. You can imagine different archetypes that are seductive in ways that play different roles in different stories. On the one hand, there could be something intoxicating in the way that makes life have the spice in it that in some regards we're all here for. And then on the other hand, it could be the kind of thing which is in a way a poison. And so the notion of the pharmacon is something I often think about. And I wouldn't necessarily place it as the sort of technical mediator of any of this, but there is something to that discernment in context as to whether a thing or substance or activity is a poison or a remedy, or in this case is something that is of enabling value or something that might be destructive of meaningful vitality or parasitic in a particular kind of way. There's a definition of parasite which I came across the other day, um, and I've forgotten the author, unfortunately, but something to it was something like the notion that, one entity uh, taking a bite or a chunk out of the other, that was always less than killing it. So it's kind of like, God, it was put so much better than that. I have to tell you that was like, but there's something to predator whose meal is less than the whole of you, but that over time is, you know, emaciating you, something like that. And so anyway, there's more to say on both of those, obviously, and there's some few things I look forward to sharing over the course of the conversation as ways I've found interesting, but I'm sure that they're probably represented in the space already. So, Aspasia, I'm curious what is present for you with this topic and what sort of draws you to explore it.
Mm. I've been thinking about intimacy and seduction for a couple of years. I think it starts really for me w- from a consideration of closeness. Like, what are we doing? What are we attempting to do when we are trying to become closer to another person, or we're inviting another person to become closer to us? Um, and closer in terms of an opening up, a vulnerability, a sharing things which we may not necessarily share so often. Um, I'm obviously biased towards thinking about two people, but obviously this is much more than just thinking about two people. This applies to groups. It also applies to an inner relationship with oneself. So we could think about intimacy and seduction even in those terms. Um, I'm really interested in intimacy in terms of something to do with the equalness of the um, dynamic. Um, it's not. It's so there's an equalness. There is something to a um, when I think about seduction, and I know what you mean about it can kind of go, seduction can be used in multiple ways. I think about it more from the manipulation point of view. But again, I think one needs to be careful because I don't mean to infer that a person necessarily is aware that they're doing it either. So that is also a feature of this. And it's partially why I'm interested in it, because I'm interested in the questions around how does one keep oneself accountable to it? Um, and also, how can one be more aware of the distinction themselves when they are in relationship with another person or a group of people and experiencing these dynamics. But I think about when it comes to something more like a manipulative seduction, I'm thinking about it as more of a performance of. So it's alluring someone in under the pretext of intimacy. This can be an intimate encounter. This can be, there can be a closeness here. Um, and I am meeting you in that same regard, right? Like, so it's almost like alluring into that equal footing position, if we call it that. When And again, I'll just talk about it as two people because it's just simpler for me and that's how I think about it, but it applies beyond that. But it's sort of like one person um, is more guarded than the other, you could say. One person comes into the interaction more from a place of, we could call it persona, as opposed to something like as best as possible, how might we be able to meet more from our essence or our core or whatever terms you want to use for it. And now that doesn't always happen straight away, but it's a commitment to that in the engagement somehow, um, as opposed to I know how to perform that I'm doing that in a way that keeps everyone, um, in a way that actually um, leads to the other person trying to meet me in a similar way. So I get something from them. I get to see something from them or learn something about them. Um, but I don't give the same in return, but I can give a performance of doing the same in return. There's something about that that's sort of what I'm talking about in terms of seduction. And I do want to be clear that, like I said, it operates in multiple levels of awareness and intent. But there is something different about ultimately. I liked what you were saying there, Tim. There's something about the what we're feeding off almost, and seduction has much more of, in the way I'm using it, has much more of a sense that the seducer is feeding off the power differential and also feeding off the taking or the experiencing of something from another without being willing to give the same in return, and oftentimes too by actually tricking the other person into I am giving you the same in return, but they're not nourishing them in the same way. So there's something in all of that. Um, I There's also something to the distinction with intimacy is not, and I know Daniel has said this previously, intimacy is not necessarily about pleasure, whereas I think seduction is much more to do with pleasure. Um, Intimacy is more like a presence or um, a holding, a being together. There's something of companionship or something. And then the other bit I just wanted to throw in too that I've been thinking about the last couple of days is also around the verb to intimate. And it's interesting because there's something in the use of that is to do with being indirect and careful in the way one introduces this sort of information or one starts to go about this dynamic. It's not just a launching forth. So there's something very interesting in that because, and I know again the language that's been used in the past, things like orbiting, and it's something to do with all that. There is an indirectness to it and a carefulness to establishing the conditions, inviting genuine intimacy that I think you can become attuned to the difference between that versus something sometimes that is like a seduction, that it operates in some different way that I'm not quite clear about yet. So I'd be interested to talk about that as well. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I'll save the rest. But that's where I'm at.
No, that's awesome. Just very quickly, obviously, a love bomb is quite different from that slowness. So it's interesting we have the word bomb there, right? It happens kind of all at once. And the other thing that comes to mind is the archetype of the succubus as being very much what you're sort of pointing to there. And then the etymology of seduction being to lead astray off the path or something like this. And the only thing I would just say there is that, and so it really does seem like energetically, energetically, I think it's really critical to speak to the negative aspects and who wants to be led off the proper path? But then the only thing I would say to that is, who's so confident they are on absolutely the right path, and that in the experience of life and opening up to possibility and being drawn into the mystery, you know, there's something there which all of a sudden things happen at once, and one can be struck by something, and all of a sudden one's at a threshold, and slowly, quickly, it's kind of outside of time in the ordinary sense in terms of what a crossing is almost. And I do, yeah, I'm definitely interested in this conversation to really, um, I suppose, stay open to the kind of dynamics of what may be at play that's beautiful. But then, of course, how beauty can so often be used to, do, well, I won't say ugly things. Maybe it's not beauty in that regard, but obviously beauty can be a form of power, or the imitation of it can be powerful and can manipulate and all the rest of it. Um, so, but that was really awesome, Aspasia. There's so much to think about there. I shouldn't really have even said anything. I just wanted to follow up. I'll leave it open.
I do think there's something too to the importance of play, like the playfulness and all of this. And I think sometimes um, that might be part of what is being experienced more in a seductive encounter as well. That is part of what maybe um, the playfulness of it, and like you say, the sort of inviting into mystery, and um, there's an adventure. But you can yeah, like bringing that into the intimacy, like bringing that into something that is intimate is important too. Yeah.
Yeah, what's coming to mind is something about like the play with ideals, or like the dialing up of certain surfaces or stimuli that might have like a real substance, but we're kind of inflating them intentionally as a way to kind of create these great forces. And I think this has already been said, but I think like seduction is very fun when it does lead into substance. So like, yeah, like the romantic encounter where there's a lot of seduction and then there's like a real grounding down to something. I think that's like that's the juice of life kind of finding its mark. But I do think like no matter how well you do that, there is always like a care needed around seduction, and a lot of the good things in life, as you're saying, they do need a patience. And quite often if you amplify the signals, you just end up attracting the wrong kind of people. And that's kind of something I've been thinking about and playing around with a lot lately, is like using time as a way to filter and have people self-select rather than specific forms. I do this from time to time, but lately I've been seduced into watching a bunch of cult documentaries again. And like cult psychology it's like the epitome of seduction. And I think a lot of it is kind of asking the question, what what is actually magnetizing these people? And I think pretty much like 100% of the time, there's a wound involved. Like we fall for the facade because it fits the crack in the heart. And so, yeah, I think like something about desperation is also in here as well. And I saw you doing a cheeky grin, Cam, when the succubus was mentioned. So over to you.
I just think it's so interesting how myth and actual occurrences, yeah, can kind of fuse in the way we relate to these ideas, and um, yeah, it's interesting. My first entry point to that word was actually through South Park, an episode of South Park, which is obviously a very humorous way of relating to. I think it wasn't necessarily the first time, but it was the first time I really considered and contemplated what on earth was being referred to with that concept. And yeah, very humorous inroads into that. I think seduction. I like the way it's being referred to as this entry point, and there can be some substance that it moves into from there. Without that, I think there's the sense that it's sort of the game, um, and the asymmetry in the game is problematic. At some point, it's there is a kind of art form to it, we can say, that's just inherent in the archetypal manifestations, and that's something that can be appreciated. Intimacy, I think, demands a lot more vulnerability in a sense. There's a kind of capture that of a kind of a power and seduction at a more superficial level. Um, Intimacy, I think, it just comes to me across to me as it's a bit more holistic in the way it demands both vulnerability and awareness of self, simultaneous to awareness of other. Um, and so I think the dynamic with seduction has the risk of being a lot less conscious and a lot less predicated on you know what you choose to ignore versus what you choose to focus on. Um, Whereas intimacy seems a lot more holistic and multi-sensory, and just something that necessarily must be predicated on safety. And safety requires a resolution in relation. It requires a resolution of consolidated sort of exchanges, and so that you're moving into this place that is uh, it's sacred. So there's a sacred element, I think, to intimacy that might be lacking in the case of seduction if it doesn't sort of lead into this greater depth. Um, and there's scattered throughout nature all kinds of examples of um, seduction not working out very well. There could be a species, for instance, that will display some aesthetic quality, and then as it draws a mate, it might kill the mate, for instance. Or it might have a whole set of a whole progression of what it's trying to achieve in that situation that could lead to the maiming or death of the mate. And so, yeah, there's a sense of a narrowing with seduction, whereas hopefully a more sort of broadening interoceptively and in relation, I think, with intimacy. And there's that way of kind of framing it as into me see, right? But we would need to expand that into a multi-sensory experience. Is seeing merely using eyes, or is it using your whole body? And how do we integrate this as a sensibility and move into an enriching art form when it comes to the nature of connection? As I think intimacy holds so much sort of um, potential for there as it becomes more of a sacred means of interacting.
Yeah, awesome. There's just so much there that's being brought in. If I just take on one of those dynamics, and so you sort of mentioned that, well, there was a particular way around you put this camp, and I think we could see both intimacy and seduction as each having a broadening or an opening as well as a narrowing to them in different ways. And sort of the image I'll give that shares how I'm at least seeing that is recognizing the man or the woman when they're stepping out, maybe to attract a date or to go on the first one. They're maybe put on some of their better clothes most of the time, and maybe the man will try and stand with a bit better posture than he might naturally fall to. But it's genuinely aspirational, but he spends half his day in a chair. But still, there's a way to stand that actually is indicative of, well, no, I'm not anything. I'm this kind of thing. And I'm a strong presence. And I want to be seen that way. And then the question is, how much of that is a front? And one could imagine the same thing with a watch on the wrist. And then all of a sudden, actually, there not being that kind of in the bank account, or the proxy for resources is not necessarily always a good proxy for whether or not there's true wealth, or whether that will be shared in a way, or whatever it is. And so there's a certain aspirational or fronting or attempt to stand in the light as expression of a particular archetype, which is not symmetrical with all others, right? It's I'm not everything, I'm this kind of thing. And I'm going to attempt to be the kind of thing that I think that you, in your not being totally symmetrical with all other things, actually do want, so that some creativity might occur at the very least. Eh? There might be some meaningful difference that fits together in some way. And then the question, so in a sense, there's a narrowing into the archetype I represent, but at the same time, in presenting that, there's also an opening of potential. And so in that regard, a great broadening of possibility. But then as we come closer into intimacy or not, there's a kind of narrowing, in a sense, of what has been selected from that broader those possible forms. But we actually meet, and it's a much more open contextualizing. It turns out we were so much more than just our attempt to present that kind of form. And actually there's the whole history and all the ways in which we are also all those other things that aren't necessarily in that impossibly perfect package, because that wouldn't be real in a sense of it. The person is not just the archetype, right? They're in fact they're the person. And so in that regard, there's intimacy opens up a much deeper, more expansive knowing. But for that safety that Cam's speaking about, or at least to enter that, taking on I suppose the responsibility to protect, the other and one in the process, there is a narrowing in the choosing and the subtlety of cultivating the kind of trust that enables that opening. So anyway, I don't know how much narrowing and opening are necessarily all that helpful ways to even look at this conversation, but I do see how there's the breadth of possibility kind of coalesces into something, but in so doing itself opens up that richness. So it's kind of moving always in and out. And that I think when we relate to potential and relate to great journeys that we might go on together, now moving beyond just the romantic domain, but something more broadly of loving possibility in life among a number of people. It's like, how often is that initial image that was initially held in archetypal, the kingdom of heaven, how much is it? Well, it turned out it ended up looking like this, not necessarily exact way the artist might have written it down. The story of the Mormons, which I watched a documentary on not long ago, they had a number of different cracks at Zion, right? And they're still going. And so the image that you may initially like seduce you into possibility obviously can turn out to be quite different. And so anyway, there's some thoughts which I'd add in.
The thing is with that example too, though, is the seeing someone and those sort of like seeing someone from the outside, seeing the way that they've chosen to present themselves physically, right? Tells you nothing about how much of what you're seeing is actually relevant to their core and their essence as well. It really doesn't tell you. And so there's still lots of different ways that you could read that, and it's not actually until you get to know the person more deeply that you would even be able to come to understand the decisions they made about how to show themselves, like on a first date, as an example, right? Like how much that is truly linked to the person inside underneath. And I think it's important to point out that those two things can be quite separate from one another. You know, like I know that's sort of what you were already saying, but it's it can also be the case that we can miss out, is also what I'm trying to say. So what I mean is that, you know, the who a person really is underneath, and once you are able to establish a deeper intimacy and really come to know the core or essence of a person more deeply through your core or essence, or however we're gonna talk about it, the intimacy that gets established there and the kind of connection that gets established there, and whether we're talking here romantically or not, but also romantically, can be of a quality that you would never have anticipated from the, like, persona level. And so I think that that also just speaks to the importance of being able to sort of start to attune to, when I'm interacting with someone or a particular group, where am I and where are we and where is the intimacy kind of sitting? Am I really in contact? Again, I'll go back to two people, it's just easier. Am I really in contact with something that is deeper or more core, or am I in contact with, again, just a part of this person's sort of personality or persona or defenses, or however you want to talk about it? Because yes, there's a reality to that you will interact with this person when they are more in their defenses or more in their whatever we're calling the other thing. But it's important to be able, for me, it's important to be able to discern the difference between which part of this person am I kind of most in contact with here, and myself as well. Like, where am I coming from? Because we can delude ourselves all the time as well. Because I think that gives us more of a sense of what is actually still, what is possible in the relationship, what remains to be possible, as opposed to, it's kind of a bit of a dead end here, like things, you know, there's not so much here that we're going to be able to develop maybe beyond this point or build together beyond this point, or I don't think you can really assess that without having some ability to discern the difference between a more genuine vulnerableness versus versus someone who is very hungry for some particular need to be fulfilled immediately, or, you know, wound to be attended to, and just sort of the automatic ways in which they are configuring, or you might be configuring, to seek that out in the interaction. So there's something in all that.
So one of the things I'm hearing you point to is most to, or at least we could draw from it, to emphasize the capacity as in this case, seducee, although you also said we can delude ourselves. So it very much goes both ways. But it speaks to the attunement piece of actually attending to what is actually coming from the core, what is more or less integrity, and then what is more or less a front. And I suppose my experience of those dynamics showing up in the world is, of course, knowing that it seems like being fooled is always on the cards in life. But at the same time, it does strike me that the real deal shines through. And as well, we'd want to include the appropriateness of aspiration to be the thing that one might not yet, but together we could be. And so that, I know, is included as well. And so this is just one of the things, isn't it? How can we cultivate the capacity to attune to and sense for the real deal, and in that regard extend ourselves, in a sense, into a kind of intimate connection before that might actually have been, you know, even potentially even signed and sealed as desired by the other as well. And so there is an interesting thing of like, well, you know, if I'm going to trust this invitation, let me discern a little bit as to where I am being invited. And that itself is a gaze. How much of that gaze should be over the boundary? as funny, so somewhat funny a story this is, but there's this guy I've recently met in the sauna, and then I bumped into him outside of a supermarket, and then he invited me to Collingwood Library at 7 p.m. in several weeks' time. But he said, "I'm not going to tell you what's happening there, you know." And I'm like, "Well, okay, I'll be there." And then he follows up and he's like, "Is it in your calendar?" I'm like, "I've put it in my calendar." You know what I mean? In this case, I suppose I have an image of what Collingwood Library is, and I have been in a sauna with him. And so, in that regard, we've shared a little bit of at least some intimacy, but I ain't really needing to inquire too much. Do you know what I mean? I don't need to tell me everything that's happening. So, but if I had, you could maybe understand it if he had said, "Look, we're going to go to this park at 11 p.m." I'd be like, "What are you going to do at this park at 11 p.m.?" You know what I mean?
I think too, even there's an upfront, you could read something into that too, as there is an upfrontness. It sounds like that he's aware that, he's not giving you all the details, and like you're both kind of signing up for that. It's part of that, like that's, and you could always follow up and ask for more details if you wanted to. So there's, again, it's kind of like more of an equal footing kind of thing, as opposed to, someone purposely. Oh, my purposely is hard to, but someone sending out a signal in a particular way that is really about getting their need met, as opposed to also taking into consideration the caring of the other in that. Yeah.
I also find it interesting to relate to these dynamics within the context of professional relations and boundaries. I consider a lot of what I'm involved in to be, by default, quite intimate, because it is inherently going beyond the persona. It is inherently being honest as soon as possible about inner dynamics and struggles, all these things that are kept private, from the public show of oneself. And so that's kind of just a normal way of relating. And I'm very conscious when I kind of navigate the world or talk to people that my settings for where conversation can go is fundamentally desensitized by the level of intimacy that is normalized psychologically in my life. And so that comes with boundaries, because there's real vulnerability in that. But it's also a kind of it's an artistic process of navigating in to see what sort of gold can be yielded ideally through that process, or at least understanding where responsibility lies in relation, when there's this kind of bounded form of engaging intimately in exchange. And so that also, I'm aware, can be quite intimidating for people who are adjusted to the persona and they don't expect to be challenged beyond the navigation of the themes relating to the persona. And this is where, people like me can get quite easily mismatched or bored in a social context, because the threshold when you're accustomed to a really meaningful engagement predicated upon intimacy, the threshold for actually engaging you in a sense of this is vitality is so much higher. And it's so much more difficult for a communication process to meet that threshold to sort of maintain that sense of relevance. It's almost like the relationship between intimacy and meaning is so resonant that when that is offset, there's almost like life is a bit more trivial. And I think that's the domain where seduction has a compensating function, perhaps, because there are these underlying needs for a sense of intimacy. And well, it could even just be the idea of intimacy being possible, and seduction is kind of an instrument for trying to get there, right? Or trying to live in the fantasy of that being alive in your world. And so, there's so much complexity to the intrapsychic dynamics and the way that sort of projects into public spaces, performative spaces, and the way different individuals are sort of differentially attuned to themselves and others in accordance with these dynamics.
Yeah, I just want to say briefly, you just spoke a whole lot of my thoughts for me out loud in that one. I resonate with a lot of that. And there is something to the experience of, when your work involves such levels, deep levels of intimacy, the ripple effects that has in the rest of your life. I think that's really, really important. I'm glad you brought that in.
Something that sort of popped into mind when I was thinking about this, it was Ronya made a post with a story and John commented on that. And one of the pieces in there was just this, what I was getting was like this capacity to empty oneself. And I've become very like unintentionally attuned to this. I think it's because it seems to be happening more often, but just how often when speaking vulnerably, people will kind of manage the conversation by like going like, yep, yep, yep. Like there's a kind of like, it's that you can feel it's like a fullness in the throat. And yeah, I kind of just getting to that emptiness to actually be able to experience intimacy is really difficult. You need a lot of time and space. And you can experience vulnerability, maybe in the case of being with a therapist, but as we've kind of said, intimacy is a reciprocity. And so, yeah, like getting empty enough and also sort of like spacious enough, because the other piece here is like a kind of capture. I'm hearing like if there's an unmet need or a drive that kind of is constantly filling the space, and the kind of dynamism that's at the core of the being isn't able to kind of play different notes. It's just kind of always drawing the encounter back to the same thing. And I think, yeah, as people are doing that, they develop like better strategies for kind of achieving that same thing. And yeah, I think like just inner space, but also not space that becomes a void. I think there's like a weird tension between fullness and emptiness there.
There's something here which I think you'll find interesting, Tom, because what comes to mind is one of the ways that Forrest will articulate enlightenment as he sees it. And he'll speak about, to be full of light. And there's a sense here that I would not necessarily see emptiness, of course, in that way of void, as you're speaking to. I don't need to be nothing. From my experience, I don't need to be nothing in order to really listen to someone. And I can kind of, I suppose obviously I could be wounded in such a way that I might find it really difficult to listen. But to the degree I am listening, the experience is just, you could say whatever you needed to say. It's just that you can come right through, but I'm receiving it. But at the same time, my inner light, in a sense, like I've not emptied myself of what my, I suppose, like illuminated identity is or something, right? Like it's not that I see myself in that way, but the point is that I'm not lost in listening to someone. And at the same time, there's an openness. And obviously, I know you know that experience. Really, all I'm just introducing is just the analogy even of light as that which is, in a sense, like light passes through light, right? It's kind of, on the one hand, it's not really orthogonal, except like it can pass through. So it's kind of interesting, right? Like it's part of the same thing, but also you can have a beam of light going this way and a beam of light going that way. And I suppose there is a sort of an interaction that happens there, but it's God, I need to know more physics to really properly flesh that out. But I can see there's a lot of complexity that allows for sort of interaction and passing through, while at the same time treating the other source of the shining, like it's not influencing the source of the other shining in a particular way. And so it can at once like be witness to all of that while its own source is not affected by it. And yet in the context of the meeting, there is a genuine encounter and difference and all of that. But there would be some nice ways to build that out with analogy. I'd have to write about it.
There's like a wholeness and a fullness to light. But to me, again, that sounds like you're speaking about you would be in that interaction. It sounds like you're in the position there where you're kind of in your essence, in your core. Like that is as opposed to your defenses are up, your walls are up. There is something about internally being in touch with that part of ourselves. Once we're able to, I don't mean to imply that that's an easy task to do and that there aren't, but there is a stability to it, or I like the light. The light is better than stability. That is what the light. That is the illuminating part or something. And so, to the degree that the other person is sort of sharing from that place too, and it's you're receiving from that position as well, I think that speaks to what you were just describing there about kind of the light, the way that the light interacts.
Yes, absolutely.
Versus having walls up where things are just bouncing off and being
Yes.
fragmented. And oftentimes I think some of the some types of emotions are a bit like that. They're kind of like you got contact with something and it kind of like it's like it broke the light apart somehow, and now you're just aware of like anger, or you're just aware of jealousy, or it's like you didn't receive the whole somehow. There's something to this when it comes to light that I think
Yeah,
the
no.
fullness of it.
Yeah, so there's like, so where I'd love to move this, which might be interesting then, is when when one's light or source can be stolen or seduced, right, mistreated in that way. And so you can see how people can have walls to maybe prevent something like that from happening. And yet I think the thing is that in the vast majority, it feels to me that in the vast majority of, I shouldn't really say that because it is so personal. I don't think it's I don't think it's the right, almost like walls are a little bit like playing, when you play bowling, you can put the walls up, but then you're kind of playing a different sport if you always have the bars up on the side. You're never really, cultivating your aim perhaps in the same way, because oh, I could just hit the walls and it will bounce me back to the skittles. And so the walls kind of help you, but at the same time, like they're not the deep context for like the learning. And so it seems like I don't think it's walls which are necessary for the right kind of aim. And then when the right aim is there, the right orientation, then it's anyway. There's more. Please take it on.
Yeah, there's sort of like filters though. Like, I mean, walls is a bit of a stupid word, really, but they're like sort of like filters. And I just think about someone who, so if we think about seduction, someone who has been seduced into or believing that they're in a genuinely intimate encounter, therefore might be sharing their light, right, from this kind of more core place. And the seducer in this situation would be extracting what they need from that, like taking a portion of that, right, and maybe the rest is discarded or something, but they're doing that through the filter of, right, because they're not actually in their core or their essence. They are in the filters are at work, and so it's a sucking of energy that is it's already got an outcome in mind, is one way of thinking about it. Like we're doing some movements here because I need to extract this kind of energy. I need to have this kind of emotional experience right now from this person. That's what I need. And so it's like, and again, I don't want to imply it's always being done with awareness. And that's what I mean about being on the lookout for ourselves doing that. I don't want to always imply this is, so there is something to the experience of a satiation, or like an extracting. If we go with the light thing, it's extracting a portion of it, or it gets digested and taken in through a set of filters that are much more of the I don't know what terms we're going to use, persona, personality, defenses, as opposed to the core, which is where we would be in a position with the two beams of undifferentiated light, if you will. Is that? Yeah, I don't know if that adds anything.
Oh no, absolutely. I'm right there enjoying the flow, but I'll just pull back and see. It'd be lovely to hear from you, Daniel, as well.
It's interesting because I think there's a lot of people that have felt like they've been seduced, but very few people who would call themselves a seducer. Um, uh, Wittgenstein has that idea that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And for me, that would also mean that the expressions of my language are the expressions of my world. And what becomes very interesting is to kind of ask questions: what terms are similes, or what terms are distinct and therefore are pointing at something unique, right? So, like, for example, is seduction and tricked similes? Um, there's a certain sense in which it would seem like to be seduced is to be tricked. But then, of course, the question is, does someone have to intend to trick you, or for you to be tricked, right? There's also a question of, to feel intimate with someone, does that mean you love someone, right? Because I think there are many people who would say they, for example, love their family or their parents or whatever, but may not feel intimate with them, right? There also seems to be differences between, it's funny if I were to say I don't think a single person would say, if I were to ask them, do you want to be seduced? I think basically most people would say no. But if I were to ask them, do you want to be attracted? I think most people would say yes. So then the question becomes, what are the differences between seduction and attraction? It would also seem that often seduction is a retrospective assessment of an attraction. I was seduced because if at the time you felt like you were being seduced, you would probably stop, right? Unless you wanted to be seduced. And that can happen when someone enters self-destruction for whatever reason, like they want to be seduced. And there's also something here: seduced by money, seduced by people, seduced by fleet. There's this notion where there's a real versatility of what is being suggested. Um, it is possible for a person to want to be seduced, especially when people go into self-destruction. There's another aspect here where I've never met anyone who doesn't want intimacy. Like, I've never met that person, and yet it seems very rare. So what's going on? Seemingly, people don't know how to get intimacy. Now, there also seems to be a question of, if you were to ask people, what does it mean to be intimate with someone? I think a lot of people may respond with, well, they know everything about me. They know everything. I've told them everything. But it's also very interesting. And I think that kind of intimacy, actually, there would be people to say, no, I don't want people to know everything about me. I actually don't want that intimacy. But it's interesting because sometimes the word intimacy, when people say they want intimacy, it seems to go beyond just having their spouse know everything about them. Because there's lots of spouses that know everything about them, and they'd say, oh, my spouse, I'm intimate with my spouse because they know my childhood and they know all the information about me. But actually, it would seem to me most people, when they say they want intimacy, or when the word intimacy is used, it includes an intimate knowledge about a person, but something more. Like, it's not merely that someone, now it seems to include, like, you can't have intimacy with people where there's a certain refusal to be vulnerable, right? Like, there seems to be a lot of concentric circles, if I'm using that properly, where intimacy includes vulnerability, but vulnerability does not necessitate intimacy, right? Like, knowing a lot about you is necessary for intimacy, but that doesn't assume intimacy. So what's interesting is, it would seem as if intimacy as a word is at the center of a very large series of concentric circles that include many things, but you cannot assume that because you have those things, you also get intimacy, right? And because of that, that might be, like, for example, I know people that are vulnerable and don't feel intimate at all because people just use that vulnerability against them, right? Or they feel very hurt, right? So there's seemingly the word intimacy, which when people use that word, it does seem to suggest, like, deeper than love even, like, or it's what they mean when they say they want love, right? It's not merely a duty-bound thing, and it would also suggest that intimacy is not easily achieved. Like, because if it was easily achieved, I think we would see it more widespread in a certain sense, right? It does not seem easily achieved. Now, there also seems to be something about the experience of seduction or attraction that makes people feel as if it is like intimacy. Like, there's something about the experience, because it is interesting. Like, it would seem to me very often, I don't dismiss there are people who intentionally seduce someone. That happens. But I think the majority of the time, people use the powers of seduction hoping for intimacy, and then they find out they don't know how to create intimacy. Like, one of the issues is I think people use the powers of attraction and actually don't know what they're getting themselves into. Like, people want relationships. Oh, really? You want a marriage? You want to find out you're a terrible human being? You want to find out you're not as patient as you thought? You want to actually put yourself through purgatorial flames and find out that you're not the great person? Really, that's what you want. And the issue is people will seduce someone into a relationship and really not know what they're getting into, right? And so then people will say, I was seduced, when really everyone was kind of genuinely using the resources they had to bring people into relationship. Then they found out what it was, where you better be prepared for sainthood and development or you've lost your mind. And then when they find out it's that, they say it's the other person's fault, or there's almost this feeling where seduction is almost tied to a magic. Like, you use some sort of ability to bring humans into relationality, and you really didn't know what that magic, you weren't ready for the responsibilities of that magic in a certain way, right? Like, you didn't know what you were getting yourself into, and you could argue we don't have a culture that lets people know what they're getting into. And on the other side of the challenge of relationship, I think, is in fact the intimacy that everyone longs for. But it's on the other side of that challenge, and people don't even know there's a challenge, and they don't even know what it is they need to do in that challenge, right? And so there's many more things that are coming to mind. For one, if I ask someone, I do think nobody plans to stay in seduction. Like, even the people who are seducing, it's seen as a temporary thing. And now if it's an intentional seduction, it's till you get the status or the promotion at the job, and then the seduction is over. But people want to stay in intimacy. And I think there are people that can see seduction as a way to get to an intimacy that you stay in, right? And so it can be seen as a means to an end more often, whereas intimacy is seen as an end. That also, it seems to be mysterious to people what exactly it is. There's a lot more thoughts. I think, just to gesture for me, there's something about intimacy that seems to be kind of tied to a certain level of telepathy, where there's this idea that this person knows, they know what they're able to, like, know what is the case without, it's just communicated by the air itself in a certain way, right? Or, for example, they know that when you're pissed off after a day of work, they know not to take it personally because they just know you. They know the meaning of what you're doing, even if the words would suggest the meaning is opposite, right? There's a certain ability to sense the roots. I do think intimacy and history go together, actually. I think intimacy is also tied to a feeling that this person, they went to the ringer with me. Like, they took on a challenge with me. Like, they overcame something. I think intimacy and a feeling of overcoming are tied together. Certainly, I think seduction, and again, I'm saying many things. I think seduction as attraction that leads to intimacy retrospectively makes it the case that quote unquote seduction was always already part of the intimacy. But if it never transfers into the intimacy, then it feels like a trick. And I think that's one of the reasons why people can be so scared of being seduction, because it is, in a certain sense, a taste of the intimacy you're longing for, then taken from you. And also, the thing I want to say that shocks people in relationships, that makes them feel tricked, because I think seduction and feeling tricked are tied together. They are shocked in a marriage or a relationship, as Chekhov put it, by how often two people who love one another misunderstand one another. Perpetually misunderstand one another. You did something because you were trying to be nice and they're hurt by it, and you like you're just amazed by the constant misunderstanding that occurs. And intimacy that we long for is on the other side of wrestling and working through that perpetual misunderstanding. And and also, it's a misunderstanding where you don't even know where to begin, because you didn't even know this background wasn't operating from your childhood that caused this misunderstanding. You've never even thought about it. Now you have to think about it. And what now? And that all is a work of overcoming. And basically, why I mentioned misunderstanding here is because I think also a lot of people will call an attraction, or people will attract someone into a relationship, and then they just find this perpetual misunderstanding, so they feel tricked because, when we went on our first date, I felt like you really got me, but then when we got together, it was perpetual misunderstanding, so you tricked me, right? But no, that's actually just the revelation of time, that there's so much going on with us. But there's something about what I think the qualitative experience of intimacy, not merely the intimacy of I know all of the information about you, which is part of it, of course, But the qualitative experience of intimacy is tied to a certain sort of telepathy almost that is on the other side of the working through the perpetual misunderstanding we go through and don't even intend to be going through all the time. And it really, really can cause a lot of, like when you first feel misunderstood when you were doing your best, like a whole lot of anger can come up, like a whole lot of rage, and everyone can get really, really, really hurt. But on the other side of that work is the possibility, I think, of the intimacy that people long for, which is tied to basically a qualitative experience of a certain sort of depth of what is possible. Now, the thing that comes after this, I think, but I'll stop, is there's also something about when we say we want intimacy. It would seem as if we don't merely want intimacy with an individual in a kind of isolated way. There's an idea that intimacy with a individual in the right way somehow unlocks the entire horizon of life. Like there's this idea that God is love, right? There's this idea that if you actually had love, it would actually somehow qualitatively change the entire way you operated in the world. And so it would seem that intimacy is also tied to a feeling that this particular person, when you get to intimacy at the deepest level, this person has actually made life to me something that it would have never been without them. And I think not just like with them in fun, but like at all time, even when they're not around. And I think a reason why seduction or people can get so upset when they feel tricked is because for a moment they tasted that possibility of the new horizon and then it wasn't there. And I think that is strongly tied to what people long for. There's more to say.
I thought that was all outstanding. That commitment to intimacy with someone through misunderstandings, through repeated misunderstandings, through all the external pressures and change that's going on around you. Time and time again, that commitment to returning as best as possible to intimacy and working through those things from an intimate position, that over time is doing the work of bringing down one's walls or helping to point out for a person what their filters are, or like it's helping a person to see for themselves their own structures of defense. And if you can be committed to doing that from a truly intimate position with one another, then there is the care inside all of that, which allows for a coming face to face with the things about oneself that are really not from the essence or the core, that are contributing to the misunderstanding, and vice versa. And it's doing that work. It's doing that work over time, which is sort of why then, like on the other side of all of that, there can be much more of this consistent experience of this person is like someone who can read my mind. They know the difference between what I'm speaking and what's actually happening inside me. Because you are more intimately in contact on that sort of core level more consistently is one way of thinking about it, I guess. But I think this is a really, really important point, this which I think I was trying to bring up at the start when I was talking about it's not about pleasure, is that there is so much anxiety and there are so many emotions and there is so much pain and there is so much sort of wrestling with things together, and there is all of this that is going on if we're talking about sort of like a relationship over time where intimacy is deepening. That is part of allowing the deepest forms of intimacy to manifest, and that I think is different to the seductive approach, which again, I agree with you. It has a taste of something in it. It has a taste, and it's devastating. It's devastating to people to have a taste of something and then it's gone. And you know, the wrapping the story around, well, it was all a trick, and you know, is very easy to do. But there's a superficiality to the seductive, I guess, is what we're getting at, as opposed to this continuous deepening, which is a continuous deepening. But it does require us to be able to face all these very, very painful, difficult parts of ourselves, interactions with whoever the other people are involved in this. And I don't think we're well equipped to do that or to see that as something that is that can be healthy. Yeah.
Well, just as a quick point, because it could be misunderstood, when I say this kind of telepathy, like what I do not mean by that is the idea that they know what I like for breakfast. They know all the information about me. I think the strong feeling of intimacy occurs when there's a surprising experience that you've never been through together, and yet the person has a relationship with you where in that unknown, they actually meet you. Like without, like they get you. Like they hear a new note in the jazz improvisation and they get you. Because I think intimacy can be tied, like there's this idea that intimacy means, well, they know your favorite sports, they know the information about you. And again, that seems to be part of it. But there's something deeper of almost the moment where you're like, oh my gosh, because you're in a surprising situation. It's new, it's not known. Life throws something at you. And there's a way the person you were with met you. Like they knew what they played the right. There's a sense in which you're like, they played the right note and I played the right note. Like we played the right note. We didn't know what note we were supposed to play. And I don't want to say it's almost more like that than I want to say, oh, they knew what I wanted. Like, it's like, no, they did the thing that was fitting for life in this situation, given our relationship. Because there's something that happens with intimacy, in my opinion, where the world itself, like life itself, is actually included in your relationship. It's no longer simply about they did what I wanted them to do or what I thought was right, and they knew it without me telling them. There was they actually played the note that was fitting for our relationship, for the world, and for the life that we are making. And it's in a surprising experience that I think intimacy comes out. Not simply in the repetition of them knowing every morning what you like to do, but in this, they played the music and I played the music. And actually, I'm amazed I actually played the music. My gosh, we actually, like that kind of magical capacity, I want to say. There's the other part of this is there's something about human beings that are just longingly craving, like just racking their heads constantly on a subconscious level into themselves of just like, how do I open up life to the people around me? How in the world do I open up life? Like, I know there's life here. I know it's there. How do I open up? I know there's a better energy. I know there's a form of connection there. How do you access it? And it's this really deep, I think it gets really deeply suppressed and repressed because people are like, it's not there. I don't know. But there's something that happens in relation where you're just, how do I open this person up? How do I open myself up too? I don't even know. Lots of people say, I want to be vulnerable. They don't know how to be vulnerable. Like, it seems self-evident. Well, just tell them all, like, just tell them everything. That's not it. There's an artfulness to this, right? So there's something also about intimacy where you feel like you've actually cracked the code. You've actually figured out how to open life up, which is, and again, you open the other person, you open yourself, but there's an experience there of opening life up that occurs. And again, it would be another topic, but Michelle and I have had a conversation about it. I think one of the reasons, though, people don't get intimacy is because you do have to face the judgment of joy. You do actually have to experience that joy and everything you've actually, those experiences you've longed for in life that you sense, they bring a judgment and they bring a challenge. Now, that has to be elaborated on, but intimacy is on the other side of the judgment of joy. And we think we all want joy, but actually when you experience joy, we tend to destroy it and we tend to hate it because it demands too much of us. We think we want happiness, but happiness is on the other side of quite a purgatory. And so another reason why we don't get intimacy is because we cut it off from ourselves because of actually what it demands of us. Now, that has to be said, and there's actually more to be said on the seduction, but I'll stop.
Yeah, awesome. There's a few different ways that I would need to slightly chunk things in order to, taking it all at once, I think I'd lose a couple things, kind of have to build into it. Because it seems like one thing that could be particularly valuable to continue to develop in this conversation is not just, what these things are, but also how to help each other see, and maybe to help others see what moves, what the possibilities are for becoming more intimate as desired, right? And I think desire is obviously a lot into it, like, so a lot to do with this, the perception and being in touch with desire and another's desire speaks from another angle to some of what you're pointing at. And one of the ways that's coming to mind that would be helpful to do that is I could take an example of a football team, or an example of contexts which are, in some regards, going to have clear limitations on the kind of intimacy as usually spoken about, that would be taking place there. And when you spoke initially, Daniel, about sort of many concentric circles, and maybe you've got to have a bit of everything in order to be intimate, I agree with that. And at the same time, that could be read as all intimacy is the deepest thing possible that you can only do with like one other person, and all the other parts just have to be. And there's a sense in which, at the level of ultimacy, and this would invite obviously people's relation with God and what have you as an example of ultimate intimacy, but so that there is this sense that when it comes to sort of a certain kind of absolutes like death and like joy in its purest form of opening to potential and creativity and these sorts of things, there is a the kind of maximal or ultimate opening to where sort of transcendence and its relationship to one's sort of deep situatedness with their context of belonging as such. There is a certain concentric circleness to the depth element, and it might be like only on that day after making the journey with just a particular person or group of people given, and that's the kind of thing for myths and archetypes and what have you. And so I'm not putting that to the side. I think that's a real thing. However, that's not practical at the level of tomorrow, right? And that's also what we're speaking about. And so when I think of then football teams and what have you, and obviously I like to think in terms of context of belonging, as we all do, but that kind of gives an example of where, like, in principle, you might have a sense of, well, there's enough of a mutual desire here for the team to play well and maybe win games and have a certain kind of experience. And then, of course, it's not always the case, because some people maybe want to play this position and the other person wants to play that position, and they may be more interested in something that somewhat detracts from the team a little bit too much because they want to play. So there's all these kinds of things that have to be worked out. But it's also a case in which, people can get angry and all manner of things. And you can say, oh, well, we understand why they're angry because the team isn't doing well. But then sometimes that can still be a barrier to intimacy, because it's like you've brought too much of the archetypal presentation of anger into something that's actually only sitting here at this shallow Sunday league level. And you've kind of lost the broader context of ultimacy within which this is actually like a practice ground for relating, and yet it still is a real context of risk and praxis as such, because you can get injured and people are investing their time. And so there is being attuned to what is of value that people are currently participating in the immediate context is a way to bracket and delimit a way of accessing what the grounds for consideration are as to those moves to be made with intimacy, or what the conditions of possibility are. And it is interesting how those different levels, in a sense, or different domains do relate more metaphysically, but it's still, I think, it's allowed me, I would say, like a certain sense of friendship and intimacy with people, uh, even just for brief times that aren't meant to necessarily continue and may on the face of it be quite basic. And yet there was a certain, we're checked into what's going on here together. Or like when there was an earthquake that a couple years ago, and the whole apartment building shaking, and I'm running outside, and the story doesn't really need this, but I was happening just to be wearing my boxers. Now, in a sense, that's a kind of, intimacy. But it wasn't so much that. There was that, plus the fact that, I borrowed this guy's coat because it was cold, and we'd all been through the experience, right? So there was a shared rupture in the context of belonging that was quite obvious we were all in relation to. And then how we showed up to the real of that, whether or not we were actually like in that context showing up for each other in right relationship, given that is a kind of context for intimacy, and showing vulnerability there. I mean, showing vulnerability there on the one hand, a way to do that in a way that protects oneself is there's a kind of showing that, in a sense, the vulnerability is not necessarily like of one's own essence, or like that one's own essence is inherently weak or in whatever way, although that may be the case, but that there is something which is constitutive of all of us, actually, that I'm pointing out as I am kind of also vulnerable to. And there is something that, when that is done in the right way, on the one hand, for anyone who's really paying attention, I'm pointing out, I'm sort of stepping forward as an example of shared vulnerability, which is inclusive, and I'm not actually risking demeaning myself in some way. However, the only thing I will say, to add in the other piece that I wanted to bring into this, because you also said, Daniel, that people, intentional seduction does happen, but it's not as common, and there's a sense in which I agree with that. And the broader point you're speaking to as to the confusion or misunderstanding about what we are necessarily engaging in on the pathway toward intimacy very much holds. But I would just like to sort of specify a very broad class of this kind of dynamic occurring, where we can also bring into question the degree of consciousness around the seduction or not. It's for sure being languaged in a different way. But let me just say that, like, the collective delusion around it is a bit thin, in my opinion. And there's only like so much, surface level understanding I have for people's confusion about it. And it is, in a sense, not all of it, but is so much characteristic of being a gun for hire as a salesman, advertising, influencing, precisely, where kind of drifting and all these kinds of things come into it. And of course, there's something totally noble around the presentation of value. This is not like I'm not really looking for, as my dad so often did to me, because as a boy, I was always challenging him about being a salesman, and he was always sort of defending sales to me, and you're helping people solve problems, all the arguments, right? And the presentation of value. And of course, there's something to that. But there's also this sense of scripting how the interaction needs to go in order to, again, get that outcome that Aspasia has sort of framed this conversation with, in which there is an instrumentalization of all of that which we're speaking about. And, like, it is arguably of that category of seduction in ways. And I do think that it is one of the things which does contribute to the erosion of that trust in whether or not we can name our shared context of belonging. Because do you actually really care for it, or are you acting like you do because you've got this other thing you're in service to? It's something like that. But then that also brings in the broader cultural questions of whether or not we can, in fact, of course, as we know, really name what is influential on our context of belonging. And so at that point, it does become, in a sense, a certain artfulness of navigating social, cultural, philosophical patterns, which are less to do, in a sense, just with the psychological level of analysis, although they involve that and how we broach those. But because of I think, the insidiousness of the ways in which our contexts for relating are challenged in so many ways, someone's whole career is, in effect, like, potentially vulnerable to its playing a role in disenabling intimacy. Careers are built around disenabling intimacy, in a sense, because it's like, oh, we don't want to, actually reckon with the fact that most of the chocolate is like kind of comes from cacao where there's child. We just, because, we can't figure out how to change that, or there's other aspects. And so But nevertheless, it becomes, well, what are the proximal contexts of belonging or of shared valuation can we tap into where we are like experiencing a certain mutuality or resonance of desire and authentic resonance, as you'll speak to, that we can sort of build up from. But then it's just there's these structural elements where it's like, and this is where, so what plays the role of the transcendence, of the transcontextuality of what can help to hold and bind together when we start to encounter that which actually does rupture that context of belonging or shared valuation through which we are orienting our intimate, coming closer into intimacy. And, those things are just it's just so challenging for people. Anyway.
Maybe too that part of the framing for me is also it's more of a faux intimacy that I'm also pointing to, as opposed to seduction per se. And so what I mean by that is like a salesman going door to door, for example, right? There's sort of I think there'd be more of a social understanding of what is happening there. Now, not for everyone, right? But there's, and so someone is here and this is their job and they're trying to make money and put food on the table and they're selling me a product, and they might also really believe in that product, but there's sort of an entering into a dynamic there that is not really necessarily an intimate encounter, right? And we all sort of understand that to some degree, versus something more like, like an influencer online, back when they used to be able to do this, at least, just pretending that they happen to try out a product and they're having just an intimate chat with you, and it's great and it's really, and it works really well, and and they're just being paid to say that, and it actually doesn't work really well. And so that's just a sort of a weaponizing of intimacy, if you will. That is an attempt to come across, this is what I'm talking about, an attempt to invite someone into something that I think they know full well, or at least semi-well, is the appearance of, it's just you and me chatting and I'm being as raw and vulnerable as I can be with you, but they're not. It's coming from a different level and with different motivations. And I think about that a lot too. I know I've spoken about it before in the past with things like everything I see when I go to, any kind of business conference, or, just all the, and a lot that I see, I don't mean to characterize a whole field, but a lot that I see in the coaching realm, and just all this stuff of, we're going to teach you ways that you can, essentially what I'm saying, you can pretend intimacy. You can invite, you can kind of coax out of someone intimacy. And you can do the thing that makes it look like you are being intimate with them, because we know that's good ultimately for a sense of trust and safety, and they'll work better for you, and it will, contribute to your profit and all these things. Yeah, I know, Daniel, you were going to jump in, and I'm keen to hear.
Well, just two quick things. First, everything you said, I agree with, Tim. There's a way in which the problem is in which nobody knows how to do anything basically today but seduce one another, because we don't know how to disclose the mystery of life to one another by which we mutually participate. So there's a certain way in which no one is intending to seduce, and then everyone is seducing. And I do think there's a systems level to be argued as you go up the scale. You do have more intentional manipulative behavior, because then there's also questions of, is seduction and manipulation similes, or are there differences there, right? And to me, I suppose the word seduction, I'm thinking of that one-on-one relational encounter, although I do not dispute at all that there are certainly forces at work that are basically looking out for us in their image and likeness, quote unquote. But I do think part of the issue is that we live in what's the difference between seduction and persuasion? What is the difference between getting someone to buy your product, marketing, and seduction, right? What's very interesting to me is all of these different terms all share a certain, it is what you should expect to define a world where people don't know how to disclose life to one another. Like, they don't know how to pull one another into a story, how to show them a dance that pulls them in. They don't know how to pull one another into life. And so all anyone can do is seduce. But then the thing is, when you like, and I make the example of a marriage, but the thing is, once you pull people into a relationship, if you cannot in that circumstance thrive, if you're not able to tap into the mystery of life, the marriage may not get a divorce, but it will lose its thriving. And so we, in a sense, we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what we're doing. We're dealing with these incredibly powerful forces and we want them. But when we get them, we don't know what to do with them. And so we're just in this whirlpool of seduction and persuasion and pulling people closer. And then when they're there, we don't know what to do with it and push it away. And on it goes. And so this is part of the drama of the situation we are in. And I think this gets into why Voicecraft is so important, because we don't have the art of actually opening up the mystery of life to one another, which relationships without, they don't do well. And I guess as a very quick note, I don't disagree at all that you can find intimacy in football. I wrestled and et cetera, so forth. So what I want to say is when you have a bounded or defined environment, like this is the field, the experience of intimacy it can be a form because it's kind of delineated. You have because the reason why is because everyone shares the world in a certain way. They share the background. And I actually think it's really important in life to have those experiences. So for example, if you have an earthquake, we share the world, right? The trick becomes how to find intimacy with people that don't share the world and to do the work of creating the binding principle. Now, a lot of people think that if I get married and we're committed to one another, that the commitment is the shared background, if you will. It's not. It's actually a commitment to the work of finding the shared background. And then it turns out there's a limit to a shared background because surprising stuff happens. So what ends up happening, what I want to say is you have to go through life moving from the experiences of intimacies you have in more bounded situations, like clearly defined situations, to actually having intimacy in surprise, the unknown. In a certain sense, there's defined intimacy, if you grant me this language, and then a kind of undefined intimacy. That transition to the undefined intimacy is the $1 million challenge that is very often lacking and that people don't have. But then because they say had it in wrestling, they know it's possible. They had it with their friends at college. But actually the experience of the intimacy in those bound situations adds to their torment when they don't have it later in life, because they know it's possible and they don't know how to access it anymore. And because the problem is, in a sense, the past kind of gave them it let them feel as if the situation would provide the bound. It would be delineated. But now you have to do the work of the delineation. You have to do the work of the background. And no one told you that. You didn't know that. And now you do. And the only way to do it's ultimately the mystery and gets into beauty and all the other stuff that we talk about, because the background, it has to move from a limit of the game, a limit of the situation, to actually the excess limit of life itself. And there's more to be said.
So there is that there is that from, like, let's say, the inside out self back into the, to take accountability for and what have you in the background. But I think it is worth emphasizing the part that you did recognize is here functioning. But from my perspective, there is so much predation on the there's predation on the intermediate backgrounds, contexts of belonging. And so it's not something, because you can't, if we think belonging as belonging, right? Obviously, in touch with desire, right? To be in touch with desire and others' desire is, in a sense, to be in understanding with what their longing is in some way, right? If we play with those words, then this is where all the structural advertising stuff and then the orient, like, gaming can come in. Here's a social community for you, but its end point is your entrapment in my virtuality, and those skills aren't going to transition out of it. And so there's the seduction and structural manipulation of where it's very likely that excess energy is going to go. And then so the question is, like, and then of course the philosophy comes in at a level that can support a kind of reflective awareness about these dynamics, and then we can communicate and interact at those levels. But it seems like there is just a tremendous vulnerability to predate on before the possibility of that kind of education toward the reconstruction. And if we look throughout our history, and it's like, well, for all the period of time when we were in tribes, it was like the prospect of having to reinstitutionalize the structure of tribe as such, that everyone had to go about with that as a kind of predicament, sort of isn't there in this, in a way. And I'm not saying that's the best example of where we are today, but there's something about that. And so I think a great challenge is, again, almost like from a slightly middle out perspective, how can it be the case that I don't have the answer to this, but like what is it to be in a dress at the level of a kind of middle layer community bounded background, and to open its possibility from there. It's I just wonder, and because I wonder at the level of coordinating community, let's say at that middle layer, I wonder about what kind of shadowed elements that are blocks in culture as such to that process happening for the group as such in a language they can relate to, given the time, energy, commitments, and their field of potential as it already is. And I maybe this brings in like legality and a whole bunch of other levels of dynamics. But there's something there, it seems like, and I'm in a complete agreement with everything you're saying there, Daniel, as well.
Can you just say that last bit again, Tim, in a slightly different way? I want to make sure. Yeah, it's okay if you can't. I dropped a couple of threads and then I wanted to get that part there.
Yeah.
So.
Well, one way maybe to see it is that on the one hand, the address can be to like the seeking spirit and its, pathway of wisdom and foolishness, as evidenced by like, Odysseus on his travels and thinking. And then there's like situations in which like whole groups of people, whole families, whole tribes, whole like, religions may be deluded, or something that are currently like, that there's something about at the level of the binding identity that is stabilizing the relations just to survive. And it may have a certain amount of intimacy to it as such as well, that there's something at the level of the intertribal or intergroup or inter-background conflict that is subject to manipulation by other factors, or just, there are dynamics of its own nature, which themselves are influential, obviously, on the kinds of intimacy that's possible to the individuals and relations that are part of them, but also the intimacy that then would be possible between tribes. And I guess, we speak about this in terms of the shamanic, and this is part of our conversations over the years proper in terms of the societal level. But I guess there's something about looking at how are whole groups of people, whole friend groups, seduced by this or that, whether it's a technology or a political movement. And so, and again, we can speak to it. So speaking to it at the level of the individual, but then also like, there's like, there are maybe certain egregoric levels. Just we'll be returning to that conversation, won't we, in a couple of weeks' time? I don't know. So I'm kind of pointing toward that, but I'm not doing
that
best
lands job. Like the way the economic substrate would shape how two communities are seeing each other, as a really basic example. Yeah, that sort of tracks with what was coming to mind earlier. I think New Zealand is a really interesting example here, and I'm generalizing massively, and I think this is starting to change, but New Zealanders are almost impossible to seduce. They just do not give a shit about any like grandiosity, and that the one way to like turn off a New Zealander is to do anything other than the most like concrete and grounded thing. And this is really tricky because a lot of like the logos that we currently have around community, particularly in these spaces, is very Americanized. And so the question of like, how do you take that sort of intelligibility, form a community, and then have it not fall victim to the fact that like New Zealanders just don't interact that way. And so, yeah, I think there's like a something about, well, you could ask the question of like, why is New Zealand like that? And I think there's probably a lot of things at play there, but one of them is just like being off to the periphery and being very close to the land. You know, like the more kind of hyper the reality becomes, the more smoke and mirrors there are. And yeah, I think there's sort of one of the things we suffer from. We're very grounded, but we often lack like a mobilizing energy. Everyone just wants to stay insulated, kind of on the ground. And we're very parochial. Like no one wants to collaborate. And so, yeah, I think there's actually like a very interesting dialectic there that I've been sort of negotiating. And even Kyle and I's relationship had a ton of this, of like, how do Americans and New Zealanders harmonize? Like, I think there's like a real sort of polarity there. And Australia is like this weird kind of like deformed cousin of the two.
Totally. And there's
Where all the
just a
prisoners
tiny-
went.
That was so insightful, Tom, what you said there. So insightful. And maybe like...
Can I throw in brief, just one
Please,
sentence?
yeah.
I often characterize that experience, Tom, especially when I was in Dunedin for 6 years, which is like near the bottom of the South Island, right? I characterized it as just this experience is that you're on the edge of the earth. Like you really feel it. You feel like you're just on the edge of the earth and you're just very distant from everything else and you could fall off at any moment almost is how it felt. Yeah.
One of the things I'm kind of hearing you say, Tom, is that almost like, you know, the further you are to the periphery, the more probability that the more probability that something that's opening up some more hyper reality could be like a cult. And so you just need to focus on what really works. And there's almost in that, there's almost like, can see how seeking out the core or the cities is in its own way, even though of course it's its own hyper reality and that it can't produce for itself, right? From the ground in all these ways, that maybe there is like, it's the right place for some, you know, more potent relating at the level of ideas. And then at the same time, the periphery is a place where if you do it right, you actually can have the space then to go maybe deeper into, you know, that which could be accused of being a cult. So it's, you know, it's very tricky, isn't it? They both have different, I've always seen like the bridging the two as being necessary. Perhaps we should move toward landing this. And so Aspasia, maybe you might like to share some words that begin to round things out for us. And Jurnee, if you want to obviously jump into, given you've been taking all this in, you're more than welcome to as well.
I wanted to highlight something that Daniel was saying recently around the sort of the difference between that drama of the push and pull and the experience that, you know, I'm sure everyone has had of being in something that is like that versus maybe something more like if we go to the intimate, it's more like a I reveal. It's like it's a I am choosing to reveal something and I am committed to looking into to see. So there's something about that has a difference to do with movement as well, which I think is important. And maybe that speaks to something around the kind of centeredness or the more groundedness of, so again, this isn't exactly right, but when we're talking about intimacy of that kind versus something that is more of a superficial level, excitement of seduction, pushing, pulling, kind of the more chaotic maybe. Because I think you're exactly right, Daniel. So much of this is about people have no idea what they are heading towards. Like the people have no idea the energies that are involved, if we put it in those terms. You think you're signing up for something that you probably don't know what it's going to be like and what it's going to ask of you and how it can form and grow you if you allow it. But that can also, in saying that, that can also get very easily confused with a more sort of chaotic, superficial, very unhealthy style of relationship too. The endless sort of drama that is more to do with, again, pushing and pulling. It's like, oh, got too close and just sort of push away. And then oh, but I want. And then they're like this sort of, there's a violence almost to it. It's a strong word, but there is something, and it's got like a movement quality to it that you can sense is very different once you attune to it internally. You almost feel like you are having this kind of like a ripping apart of oneself or something, as opposed to the challenges that you face when you're in an intimate relationship. If you're both able to sort of hold that position, can still be deeply painful and challenging and troubling and all these things. And aching and all this stuff, but it's less like it is less like an internal sense that the other person is sort of like reaching in and pulling parts of you out, is the only way that I can describe it. To me, that is much more related to getting caught up in something of, and maybe seductive isn't the right word, it's probably not, but something more like a sort of obsessive or superficial kind of entanglement that still can elicit sparks of what it might be to be intimate with someone, and that continues the chase often. So yeah, there's I think so much of this is tied up with building our capacity to be with all of the challenging, painful, difficult unfoldings of relationship with one another, whether that's groups or two people, and how we read those signals in real time and what we do with them together, as opposed to ways that we are trained to do things with them, which I think is very much at odds with how one actually goes about deepening intimacy over time. I'll just, yeah.
Well, I'll follow on with that point, Aspasia, because I think that's what has stood out for me through this conversation as well. The kind of economic incentives running counter to the reality of the mystery of what it is to be, and all of the wall building which comes with this reality denying mode of exchange and transaction and extraction and all that. A few days ago, I'm just going to tell a story because I don't really know how to encapsulate everything that's been spoken to. It's all been great. And like Tim said at the start, it's kind of all already present in the space. Went down to a planting day with like an ecology-minded business. And there was an Aboriginal group there, and they did a welcome to country, and they were doing a smoking ceremony. I haven't done anything like this before, but it was interesting hearing the gentleman speak about smoke, and he was making a point that there were no walls built between different regions of the land. There was smoking ceremony always on the boundaries to kind of, you're stepping through a kind of ephemeral wall. It's something that actually has this ability to like mark a transition or a change in one's, there's a different etiquette here, there's different forms, there's a different cultural code, however you want to frame it. But you don't need to pass through it physically in terms of stepping over or stepping around or cracking through, because change isn't actually bound in this or that space. It's obviously all interconnected. So there's a real intimacy there that they're speaking to. Now, I don't know if historically speaking, and I actually just don't know, smoking ceremonies were as massive a part of the culture as they are today portrayed to be. That it might be something of like a need to revive and re-legitimize through a history of suppression and destruction. But anyway, the whole experience has kind of just had me thinking about intimacy as a willingness to step through the haze of not quite knowing. And maybe also just to play counterpoint to Tom regarding New Zealand as being quite it's funny because I just think like also they're so prone to like hard tribal dynamics, either religiously, gang wise, lineage wise. Like it's just funny to me that like they're both unwilling to collaborate. I think that was the point you were making across tribes, but they actually are kind of very willing to engage in like me and mine type hyper reality, but for the few. And so yeah, I guess I'll just point to that as a thread towards the end here, which is quite interesting in terms of having the conversations so far regarding the definitions and ways in which intimacy and seduction show up actually be applied in where we are at. So yeah, I've really enjoyed this, guys. Hopefully this can carry on.
That was an awesome session. There's actually quite a few New Zealanders represented in Voicecraft, to be honest. I mean, Jurnee's obviously, we were born in Perth, right, Jern? But you're obviously, no, you were born in New Zealand. When did you go to Perth? What age? Like 7 or 8?
8 months old.
I have
so
to bow
8
out
months old.
here, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks heaps.
See you later, Tom.
Nice to see you all. Good to see you, Daniel.
Great to see you, Tom.
Nice to see
Wonderful to
you,
see
Tom.
you.
Yeah.
Well, there's actually
Nice to see
4
you.
then. 4 New Zealanders, even in this conversation. And then there's a few more, right? Richie, are there any more New Zealanders? I think that might be it. But that's, anyway.
It is
For another
interesting. I agree.
It is. No, it is. It's something there. But we'll bring this one to a close now. I'll stick around for a little bit. Thank you, everybody.